participants, thank you so much for being here with us today. We are delighted to welcome you all to the first side event of the ESCAP Third Committee on Energy Access in the Asia-Pacific region. Thank you. My name is Olivia Baldi. I am an energy access consultant at UN ESCAP, and I will be the master of ceremony for today's virtual session. This side event on energy access will be structured around 3 sessions of approximately 30 minutes each. The first session will be an introduction to the status and policy direction of energy access in the Asia-Pacific region. And it will be followed by a second session to launch 2 ESCAP reports, which rigorously investigate the impact of programs that improve access to electricity and to clean cooking fuels and technologies. Last but not least, the issues and opportunities from beyond the energy sector will be discussed during the third session. So time permitting, we will have questions and answers at the end of each of the 3 sessions. Please feel free to raise your question to the panelists while the presentation is ongoing through the Microsoft Teams chat window. Please identify yourself with your names and the country or organization that you are representing, and our moderation team will collect your question and put them together at the end of the session. Please note that the meeting session is recorded and that this event may be followed in real time by public observer via YouTube. Finally, we are very interested in your feedback, so we welcome you to fill the evaluation questionnaire that we will be sharing at the end of the event. We would also welcome any further comments or insights via the ESCAP Energy email address, so please contact us after the event. Thank you. Finally, I would like to remind all of our attendees that this event will be followed by a 30-minute break before the second side event on the phase-out of coal that will start at 12 Bangkok time. And the final session of the committee will then begin at 2 p.m. Bangkok time. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mr. Ongpen Liu, Director of the Energy Division, United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to make the welcome and introduction remark. So, Mr. Ongpen Liu, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Olivia. Distinguished participants, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, good morning or good evening. We also have colleagues joining from New York. I'm honored that you could join us for today's site event on energy access in the Asia and Pacific region. I'm pleased to open this site event and to welcome our distinguished speakers. Thank you all for taking the time to join us for today's discussion. So energy access is a key component of SDG 7 and have an important role to play to achieve the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Together with the Asian Development Bank, ESCAP is working on the review of the progress on SDG 7 in Asia and the Pacific region annually. We also contribute to the global review by SDG 7 consortium comprised by UN agencies, IEA, IRENA, the World Bank, and other regional development banks. So in terms of access to electricity, based on the existing planned policies, the Asia-Pacific region is set to achieve universal electricity access by 2030. However, in 2018, over 200 million population still had no access to electricity, around 5% of the region's population. But from this 2 days discussion, probably now, if this year's data, we will see a big progress for energy access. So, but however, urban population and rural population, there is a big difference. The urban population approached the universal access in 2018. It's almost 99.7%, almost 100%. But people in rural areas lagged behind. It's around 92%. So off-grid renewable energy technologies represent a viable electrification solutions in rural areas. with the emphasis on support from modern lifestyles and productive issues. However, the region has demonstrated slow progress in access to clean cooking. That's another important part of energy access. In 2018, around the 1.8 billion population, nearly 40% of the population in this region, relied on polluting and unhealthy cooking fuels and technologies. The region is far from being on track to achieve universal access to clean cooking by 2030. So clean cooking targets must be integrated into national energy plans. New investment and additional resources are also needed to support the development of options that meet consumer needs and overcome barriers, such as cost and cultural preferences, while limiting government spending on subsidies. Clean cooking is tightly intertwined with the gender issues. Women and children are currently disproportionately impacted by unclean cooking practices, especially by air pollution, indoor air pollution, time spent gathering fuels, and also exposure to the risk of violence when traveling to collect the fuels, especially firewood. Far more work, investment, and policy commitment are needed to ensure that these shortfalls is addressed. I'm pleased to welcome Mr. Yongping Zhai, Chief of Energy Sector Group at the Asian Development Bank, Yinka Kadizanova from UN Women, and Paramita Mohanty of the UN Environment Program to share their perspectives on these matters. I know they are experts from different aspects for energy access, so that's really a very good opportunity. We can hear from them their experience and their views. So in the first session, we will hear from our ESCAP colleague, Sergey Tulinov, who will present an overview of the status of energy access across the Asia-Pacific region, use the data from Asia-Pacific Energy Portal. And we will then also have Olivia from Sustainable Energy for All, an important partner of us, and also key advocate of the progress in energy access. So in our second session, we also plan to launch 2 reports that are outcome from many months of detailed research led by ESCAP Energy Division, investigating and seeking to rigorously quantify the benefits of electricity clean cooking access. To present to you with these findings, I also welcome our former colleague Lana Zaman, who is now joining us from New York in the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA in New York, and Farhan Rana from ESCAP. In the last session, we also have the discussions about the findings of the work and other experts' research. We want to stimulate a discussion on the broader interdisciplinary nature of the available solutions. I know all of you have experiences and also knowledge about this topic, and I really think this is a good opportunity that the issues are brought about lack of access and the benefits that are unlocked through the previous provision of access extend well beyond the energy sector. For this reason, we feel it is very important to understand the perspectives of health, of financial support, of the working towards gender equality, and the stakeholders with understanding of the private sector's role in commercial and economic development in delivering outcomes in energy access. So the challenges of energy access are among the most difficult under the Sustainable Development Energy Agenda. We're particularly keen to hear your views on the problems that we face and to improve our understandings for your specific sub-regional and national context. We also would like to learn from you your experiences from countries, from different sub-regions on the energy access. We hope that we can find a path forward that will deliver universal access within a decade and we catch up on the universal access by 2030. And we know that the benefits are significant and the opportunities are wrong. I thank you very much for all in advance for your active participation, and hand back to Olivia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hongpen. Thank you for your introductory remarks. I am now very pleased to introduce the first session of the side event about the status and policy direction for energy access across the Asia-Pacific region. For this, I will hand over to David Ferrari, our session moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Olivia. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you, Olivia, for your kind introduction, and Hongpeng for your opening remarks. My name is David Ferrari. I'm a member of the Energy Division here at ESCAP, and I'll be your moderator for the upcoming discussion. Firstly, some housekeeping. As Olivia mentioned, we do hope to have time for questions at the end of each session. But in the interest of saving time, we'll take your questions via the chat or comment box in your software and put these to the speaker panel at the end of the session. Please feel free to ask questions or make comments at any time throughout the presentations, and time permitting, we'll raise your questions when we can. Of course, if we have time, we would like to take the questions verbally from the floor. So if we do have time, we'll invite further participants to raise their hands and to speak when invited. Noting our time constraints, I'll apologise in advance now if we're unable to address all questions, but please be assured that today's event is just a small part of an ongoing discussion. We do value your input, and our team will take note of questions and comments to guide our future discussions and events. For now, please allow me to introduce my colleague, Sergei Tulinov, who will provide an overview of the status of energy access across our region. Over to you, Sergei.
Thank you very much, David. Hope you can hear me and you can see me. So, good morning, dear participants. Probably good afternoon for someone. While presenting the status of energy access across the region, I'm going to use the Asia-Pacific Energy Portal, Energy Knowledge Hub developed by UN ESCAP to facilitate research, analysis, and informed decision-making on energy within the Asia-Pacific region. I'm sharing my screen right now, and I hope you can see now. I hope you can see now my web browser. Just a second. I'm sorry for a small technical glitch. Can you see it now?
Not yet. We can't, Sergei. Perhaps it's because you're spotlighted. I'll just stop spotlighting you.
Oh, yes, please. I think now it should work. So I'm going to do a live portal demonstration if it works well. Yeah, I think it finally works. You can see now the landing page. David, can you please confirm?
Yes, that's coming through clearly now, Sergei. Thank you.
Perfect. Yeah, I'm sorry for this. So yeah, you can see it on the screen. It is a live demonstration from my web browser. So the portal, the Asia-Pacific Energy Portal, it supports the tracking progress towards SDG 7 and other global, regional, and national targets. And the portal has a collection of more than 200 datasets from global institutions, including UN Data, the IEA, the World Bank, Comtrade, IRENA, and many others. So more than 7,000 power plants across Asia Pacific have been mapped, and more than 3,000 policy documents have been collected from hundreds of official websites. Yeah, and also the portal has the energy profiles of all ESCAP member states. So to save time, I have preloaded the charts generated by the portal, but actually you are 2-3 clicks away from one chart to another. It is very fast and user-friendly. So let's talk about the electrification. As of, and Hongpen has already mentioned it in the introductory remarks, as of 2018, continued electrification efforts across the Asia-Pacific region has brought electricity to 95%, more than 95% of the region population, even as the population grew. So since the year 2000, so 1.3 billion people have been provided access to electricity, and universal access has nearly been achieved in urban areas. So it's 99%, almost 100% in 2018. Though the electrification rate and quality of service remain lower in rural areas, it's only 92%. So among 200 million people in the region remain without electricity. More than 3/4 live in South and Southwest Asia. Let me switch to South and Southwest Asia. So, and it's 153 million people. Although the rapid grid extension in India and deployment of off-grid solutions in Bangladesh have really helped to reduce the sub-region unelectrified population significantly. But I think there is only one country in this sub-region where the electrification deficit is increasing with a growing rural population. I'm talking about Pakistan. You can see it on the screen now. So let's move quickly to another sub-region with also very substantial number of people still without electrification. I'm talking about Southeast Asia. So in Southeast Asia, 29 million people living without electricity. So the largest deficit is in Myanmar, where 18.2 million people have yet to be reached. Meanwhile, in Indonesia or the Philippines, so you see the Philippines on the screen, they have demonstrated strong progress in providing electricity to the populations through on and off-grid approaches. Also, a very good example of strong government commitments and efforts to provide electricity was in Cambodia. So Cambodia, you can see on the screen the total population without access from 2000 to 2018. Cambodia, in 2010, Cambodia had one of the region's lowest electrification rate. If we move to 2010, it shows us like 8%. Let's move to percentage, Cambodia. So now it was 41% of population was without electricity. Now I think with 60% did not have access to electricity. So now 91% of Cambodia population is electrified. So this is really substantive progress has been made. So overall, the region is largely on track to achieve universal access to electricity by 2030. As of 2018, 38 ESCAP member states out of 57 had access rate 100% and 99%, and only 6 countries had less than 80% access to electricity. Then we can see that most efforts should be done in this region to provide access, in particular in rural areas, in a few countries. So now let's move to status of access to clean fuels and technologies for cooking, clean cooking. So let's move to clean cooking. Progress is modest at the regional level and highly varied among Asia-Pacific economies. In 2000, almost 2.3 billion people, more than half of regional population, were reliant on polluting and harmful cooking solutions. By 2018, the number of people without access to electricity is 1.788 billion people, so it's almost 40%. So for 40% of population. Clean cooking rates are low and the rates of progress slow in many economies. So if we look at the overall picture, ESCAP-wide, in 2018, 10 ESCAP countries had clean cooking access rates less than 25%. An additional 12 countries had access rate of 50% or less. Several Pacific Island nations are among those with lowest rate of access. So although regional progress is quite slow, there are some country champions, I must say, who has done tremendous efforts to achieve access to clean cooking within a relatively short time. So Indonesia has done it from 2000, from 6% to 80% in 2018. So also Vietnam has made tremendous efforts and demonstrated one of the fastest rates of clean cooking access improvements.
Sorry to interrupt, but I will ask you to wrap up.
Yes, I'm concluding my presentation. I'd like to emphasize that the quality and quantity of data for energy access is insufficient. So there are methodological inconsistencies, irregular and infrequent data collection. So it's really present challenges to track Goal 7. And the more data is needed to better understand energy access in terms of quality, reliability, and affordability. So please visit Asia Pacific Energy Portal for more information and data. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking more time. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. That's a very useful presentation. And I see we already have questions coming through in the chat window, which we'll get to after our next speaker. So please do continue to raise questions as we go. Our next speaker is Sustainable Energy for All's Technical Lead of Energy Finance and Clean Cooking, Olivia Coldry. We're very, very glad you could join us to speak today, Olivia. Please take the microphone.
Thank you very much, David, and hello everyone. I'm the second Olivia on the program today, which is unusual. Great to be here, and thank you to our ESCAP colleagues for the opportunity to join today's discussion and to speak to policy directions in delivering universal access. I think Sergey set the scene very well, so I hope to complement what he said, particularly to underscore the policy aspects. ESI for All, as you know, works globally, so I also hope to bring an international flavour to the discussion and look forward to your questions. So I'd like to start in a slightly novel way by talking about money, which is intimately related to good policy, and I hope that sets the scene for some of the discussion today. As some of you may know, ESI for All has for many years now undertaken comprehensive tracking of finance commitments for both electricity and clean cooking, through our flagship Energising Finance Research Series. Now that's important because money tends to follow good policy. So I just want to sort of outline some key points now, again, for context and background. Last year we produced the 4th edition of a report that we call Understanding the Landscape, which looks at energy investment in 20 countries globally with the highest energy access deficits. So of those 20 high impact countries, as we call them, 5 are tracked for electricity and 7 for clean cooking in the Asia Pacific. What we've found year on year now is that energy investments are quite highly concentrated. And David, if you don't mind, I might ask you to put up the first of the 2 slides I shared with you, just to illustrate the point. Thank you. Energy investment's highly concentrated, and they're not necessarily going to the countries with the greatest needs or necessarily to the right solutions, and they're therefore not addressing the most urgent access gaps. So on the slide that you see in front of us, for instance, just 4 countries in 2018 received 88% of total finance commitments we tracked for electricity. So as you can see there on the slide, some long bars for Bangladesh, India, Pakistan and Tanzania. But really not very much money flowing to the other countries on the list. So of the remaining 12% of finance, only 1%, so that's less than $500 million, went to an Asia-Pacific country in Myanmar. And as we've just heard from Sergey, Myanmar continues to have considerable electricity access challenges. So we're not necessarily seeing a match between access gaps and money flowing to meet them. Also, despite having a relatively large access problem for electricity, North Korea received no money whatsoever in public or private finance in 2018. We might go to the next slide, please, David. Thank you. Similarly, we found the distribution of finance for clean cooking access across the high-impact countries in 2018 to be very highly concentrated. So, as you can see very clearly from this bar chart, 75% of total finance that we saw in 2018 and fully 92% of public finance was concentrated just in 2 countries of 20, so Bangladesh and Kenya. So great news for Bangladesh and Kenya, but not for the remaining 18 countries on the list. Of the remaining 25% of finance, and we're not talking a lot of finance, just over $130 million, only 2.4%, it's just over $3 million went to 5 countries in the Asia Pacific, and they are China, Indonesia, Myanmar, Vietnam and Pakistan. So you can see sort of wildly divergent statistics on finance for clean cooking access in particular. So from these statistics, we can conclude that financial commitments for energy access across the board, both in sub-Saharan Africa and the Asia Pacific, really lag the volumes required to meet SDG 7. So the International Energy Agency tells us that a lot more money is going to have to flow to both electricity and clean cooking, particularly clean cooking, to get to SDG 7 by 2030. From a policy perspective and on a positive note, it is possible to turn this around. So Rwanda in Africa is a strong example of where an energy sector transformation, in that case through really good inclusive planning, has led to a great increase in energy access and investment. So Rwanda has been one of the top 3 fast movers globally in electricity access, increasing from 10% of the population in 2010 to 35% in under 8 years. So that's a considerable move. And it's also seen a good increase in its World Bank RISE score, which indicates some real success. So there is hope, but we are still sort of well behind on the money challenge. As you've heard from Sergey, we have a pretty good picture of access now in electricity and clean cooking in the Asia Pacific. I'd like to just spend a couple of minutes reflecting on that from a policy perspective. So Southeast Asia has made great progress in expanding electricity access. Clean cooking is a slightly greater challenge. Impressively, most Southeast Asian countries have set renewable energy targets now, backed by policies, and you all benefit from the strong regional cooperation offered under the ASEAN framework. There's a real opportunity to build on this momentum, we think, to accelerate the transition. And while the seeds of that transition have been sown, they do, of course, require sustained policy support. So, for example, to reach the aspirational target of 23% renewables in the primary energy mix by 2025, Southeast Asian countries will really need to scale up their deployment of renewables in the power sector, as well as in heating, cooling and transport. Furthermore, governments are instrumental in expanding clean cooking access. So Sergey's alluded to Indonesia, and that's the example I want to give as well. So really targeted government policies in Indonesia have led to an expansion of access to 80% of the total population in 2018. So 91% of the urban population has access, 68% of rural dwellers do. That's quite extraordinary in the context of Indonesia's population and geography. So good policy works is the message. Progress has also been made to reduce access gaps in South Asia, impressive progress, which is a really notable achievement in view of the region's size and diversity. Just to give an example of a good policy intervention, cross-border interconnections for electricity trade, the efficient use of diverse power sources, and from a clean cooking perspective, many of the people on the call will be aware of the Indian government's PMUY scheme, which has pushed clean cooking solutions to the poorer sections of the community while removing subsidies for those who can afford them. And just briefly turning to the Pacific and our neighbours who are, quite often neglected, we're all aware of the SID's vulnerability to externalities such as climate and spikes in oil prices. As such, the energy transition in SIDS needs to really be built on resilience and addressing the key concern of energy security, with a continued movement to renewables and energy efficiency key to ensuring that security. So that's just a sort of a very quick tour of the Asia-Pacific region, which, as we know, is vast and diverse, but some really good examples of policy success in each of the sub-regions, I guess. I just want to spend a couple of minutes speaking about the effects of increased energy access on good health and gender equality outcomes. We're going to hear from Inka a bit later on in the program on gender, but I do want to emphasise the health point in particular. COVID-19 has really brought into focus the inequalities and vulnerabilities of health systems in the region. So long before COVID made headlines, the lack of reliable power in healthcare facilities was undermining the quality of care for millions of people, to the point where a recent survey of 78 countries found that only 41% of those countries, so less than half, of low and middle income country healthcare facilities have reliable electricity. So that's really not good enough, particularly in a COVID world where we need to deliver vaccines through a cold chain. So while a lot of attention's been paid to creation of the vaccine, and that's been a real preoccupation, much less attention has been given to the cold chains necessarily to get that vaccine to the last mile, for example. In the Asia-Pacific, the powering healthcare issue is just as much about reliability of energy supply as access. So perhaps while less of a focus in the development community today, it's still critical to both address the energy gap in the health sector, but also to ensure that the health sector pursues renewable energy solutions when doing so. So we pursue renewable energy to power healthcare. That's going to create more climate resilient health facilities in the long run. Another good policy example from the region is the government of the Philippines. With World Bank support, its rural power project has electrified more than 2,000 health facilities, schools and community halls in rural areas across the Philippines. So a good result. I don't have a lot of time, so I will actually skip over the points I wanted to make on gender, except to highlight, because we're going to hear from Inka, but just to highlight the need for data. So Sergey also alluded to this, particularly when we're targeting energy access towards women and girls who we know are disproportionately affected by energy poverty. It's really, really important to understand where the money is going to support projects, but particularly the impact that projects with a gender equality objective have or not, so that we can design better policy and design more targeted interventions to address particular vulnerabilities that women and girls experience in accessing sustainable energy. So more positively, we have seen some momentum bridging SDG 7 and SDG 5. So folks on the call working on gender equality, there is some hope. In 2019, Kenya, for example, became the first African country to launch a gender policy in its Ministry of Energy, so embedding gender in energy, which provides a framework to mainstream gender in energy policies and projects. Just a couple of minutes remaining. I just want to touch on a few of SE for All there.
But I will ask you to conclude, please. Thank you.
Okay, sure. I'll wrap up. I just want to emphasise quickly some of SE for All's initiative working in the space. We are supporting governments in Africa in developing integrated energy plans, which we hope to scale to the Asia-Pacific very soon. We are integrally involved in the COP26 and high-level dialogue convenings later this year, and I'm happy to answer questions about those for governments on the line who are interested. We're also elevating our clean cooking work at SE for All and working closely with ESCAP in that context, and I can talk through some of the initiatives we have in respect of clean cooking. So really to conclude, as we collectively strive to achieve SDG 7, I welcome everybody on the call's engagement with SE for All. We welcome your ongoing engagement and collaboration with all governments on the call, and we look forward to working closely with you going forward. Thank you, Olivia and David.
Thank you, Olivia, and thank you to our distinguished participants. I see we already have some questions coming through in the chat window. I think for two reasons. In the interest of time and also the relevance of those questions, we might hold those off until later in the agenda. So many thanks, Sergey and Olivia, for your insights and contributions. I'll now hand the floor back to Olivia Baldi, who will be your moderator for the second component of the program.
Thank you very much, David. And now moving to the second part of our agenda, I would like to welcome Lana Zaman, a former colleague here at UN ESCAP Energy Division, now joining us as Associate Sustainable Development Officer for the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs in New York, together with Farhan Rana, Energy Access Analyst at ESCAP, for the virtual launch of 2 ESCAP reports. The first report investigates the impact of rural electrification program on socioeconomic outcomes, while the second report studied the impact of clean cooking intervention on health and adoption outcomes. So the reports can be downloaded through the QR codes that are shown on the screen. And the policy brief for both reports will also be made available at the same link early next week. So please feel free to ask questions or make comments at any time through this presentation, and time permitting, we will raise your question with the speakers. So Lana and Farhan, we are very glad you could join us today to discuss some of the work you led while here at ESCAP. Over to you. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. I'm Lana. I'm presenting here with my former colleague, Farhan. As Olivia mentioned, I'm now at DESA, previously at ESCAP, and we're really thrilled to share with you today the findings of our systematic reviews on the socioeconomic impacts of energy access programs. So I'm going to share a little bit about the methodology and the findings of the electricity access portion. Firstly, what is a systematic review? So likely everyone is familiar with literature reviews. A systematic review is a little bit like that, but it very systematically identifies, selects, synthesizes, and appraises all of the high quality research and evidence to answer a specific question. So a literature review tends to be a bit more qualitative, less methodical, and more informal. For a systematic review, it's systematic, and the goal is really to examine all of the literature on that topic and to select the highest quality evidence. It additionally strives to answer a specific question and eliminate bias. Meta-analysis is an additional methodology that can be used when we have a lot of quantitative evidence. So if we have a lot of different papers, for example, 10 different papers that quantify impacts of a certain type of program or something like that, but they're all in different countries. Typically, that would be something where it's very hard to compare those different studies because their contexts are different. So meta-analysis is a statistical method that can be used under certain circumstances to combine those findings and make a summative statement. So that's part of our systematic review. So let's take a look at electricity access. The basic theory of change is that activities, including different types of electricity access, whether that's grid, mini-grid, microgrid, lead to outputs of greater access and improved reliability of electricity. This leads to intermediate outcomes, including things like increased productive hours, increased access to information, and eventually that should lead to long-term impacts. The main impacts we're looking at are improved education, improved economic outcomes, and improved gender equality. So our research question for this is, to what degree do electrification interventions impact income, education, employment, gender empowerment in low and middle income countries? So there's a lot of development literature about this, but we're really focusing on quantitative impact evaluations. One of the main supplemental questions we look at is how these impacts vary based on different subpopulations. So are impacts different for high and low income households? Are they different based on gender? These sorts of questions. A little bit about our framework. It's called a PICOS framework. So this structures how we select which studies go into the systematic review. PICOS stands for Population, Intervention, Comparator, Outcomes, and Study Design. So population, this only included low and middle income countries. The interventions were all electricity access programs. In terms of comparator and study design, this was part of what made this study unique. We only looked at studies that had what's called a valid counterfactual, meaning some kind of study design or statistical methodology to really isolate those impacts of electricity access and to demonstrate what would have happened in the absence of the program. So just to paint a brief example, if there was a study that just looked at a village and what happened before and after electrification, that would not be included because it's not necessarily correct for us to assume that any benefits are attributable to the electricity access. For the study to be included, it would need to have usually a statistical regression to really isolate the impacts of electricity. And again, the outcomes are economic, education, employment, and gender. And the methodology we followed were the guidelines of the Campbell collaboration. So just a little bit about our methodology. The search began with an electronic search using a database called Scopus, and that is a very broad amalgamation of different academic journals. So we made, based on our PICOS search strategy, we made a list of search terms and searched for those in PICOS, in Scopus. We additionally conducted some hand searches in sites like Google, Google Scholar, Social Science Research Network, and Science Direct, just to really try to make sure we find every relevant paper. So this returned to us 2,627 papers that might have been relevant. So we began screening by having our team of screeners agree on how we were approaching, and then we screened all of the titles and abstracts to see what still qualified. Through various levels of screening, we eventually got it down to 66 studies that were included in the ultimate systematic review, and 27 of these studies had enough quantitative data that we also conducted a meta-analysis with them. So this analysis actually includes 654,378 households. A brief breakdown of the study. Almost half of them were in the Asia-Pacific region, and of these, many were in South and Southwest Asia, which seems to be a trend in part due to some remaining clean cooking gaps, and also because there seems to be a lot of research in that region in general. And the majority papers were on grid connection interventions. So I'm going to show you a sample of one of our meta-analyses, and this one is on income. So the term forest plot, it comes from the concept of saying, don't miss the forest for the trees. So what you're looking at here, it's 10 different studies, you can see the names. And the plot over here, all these gray boxes show the impacts of electricity on income for each of these individual papers. This line here is 0. So everything to the right of that is positive, meaning that there was an increase in income due to electricity. And so you see 5 of these papers are really to the right of that line, so they show large increases. 5 of these papers are positive, they show a positive increase, but they're on the 0 line, so we can't conclude necessarily that there was an impact. So this is where, if you pick out just this paper or you only read this paper, you'll come up with a very different conclusion. So meta-analysis serves to combine all of these findings. This diamond at the bottom demonstrates the summative finding of all these 10 studies. And as you can see, it is very positive. It does not cover the 0, which means that, in conclusion, electrification did result in a significant increase in income. I will also say, so this is called a standardized mean difference, and a value above 0.8 is considered very strong. And this was a value of 1.1. So this is considered a large increase in income due to electrification. So based on all of these meta-analyses, here are the results in summary. With regard to education, we saw significant increases in both study time and years of schooling. In employment, we saw a significant increase in time spent working. The results for employment status were inconclusive, but I will say, as this shows, out of 10 papers, 6 of them found a significant increase. So there's some qualitative evidence there. With regard to income, both income and consumption increased significantly. And with regard to fertility, measured in number of children given in a period, there was a significant decrease. So now I'm going to go through a bit of the qualitative information in those papers to examine pathways of how these impacts happen. With regard to education, the first impact is that lights enable children to study in the evenings. Secondly, improvements in productivity in the home ultimately mean that children don't need to spend as much time helping their parents with either work or chores or things like that in the house, so they have more time to study. In terms of income, the first impact is the increased hours of productivity, which generally leads to better income. Secondly, access to information through things like cell phones, radios, and televisions. This enables people access to information about job opportunities, about entrepreneurial information, about access to different resources, and all of that can be beneficial. And lastly, people are able to buy better appliances that improve their productivity. That could mean appliances for different types of businesses. It could be farmers buying agricultural equipment, that kind of thing. This is particularly important because it's consistent with many other studies we've seen recently, including a study by UNDP that examined what tier of access led to what kinds of impacts. And that study also found that tiers 4 and 5, which is basically enough for high-powered appliances, that's really the level needed for economic impact. And lastly, an examination of poverty and inequality. So as we mentioned, income improved for everyone, and that resulted in less poverty. So while everyone benefited, there was some inequality in that wealthier households benefited more. And that's because they were able to afford more electricity and buy better appliances. So if there's a poor household that's using lights and fans, that might be a benefit, but it's probably not enough to really have an economic impact. Really being able to invest in more high power appliances is part of what leads to economic impact. I'll touch upon some of our other qualitative findings. In terms of gender, we did find that in the employment status, women were more likely to gain employment as a result of electrification. That varied a bit, but that was the average finding. Additionally, a few papers looked in depth at impacts on gender equality and found that electrification improved women's decision-making power, financial autonomy, social participation, labor market participation, and reproductive freedom. And we do see this also in the quantitative results with the decrease in fertility. I will also mention this was a bit of a research gap. There wasn't a lot of papers that looked at it, but it was an interesting space. So in conclusion, we see that electrification, based on all of these studies on average, has a large and significant impact to increase income, consumption and expenditure, working time, and employment status. It also had positive impacts on children in terms of education. And lastly, qualitatively, it seemed to result in some positive gender empowerment outcomes, as well as reductions in fertility, which may be indicative of greater reproductive freedom. So based on this, we have a few recommendations. The first is, having seen how consistent and strong the benefits are, setting unified goals and targets for universal electrification and continuing to enhance the quality of access is really a powerful tool to accelerating economic development. Secondly, although electrification benefits everyone, it certainly has some differential impacts for different communities. And for this reason, some targeted policies to help marginalized groups can help ensure that no one is left behind. Thirdly, electricity access is only ever as good as the services it supports. So coupling electricity with different types of benefits like better schools or better hospitals can really capitalize on those gains and accelerate development. And lastly, where grid extension is not financially feasible, mini and off-grid solutions based on renewable energy sources demonstrate a very cost-effective solution. This particular study, we found that all different types of connections are beneficial, and based on recent technologies, there has been advancement in mini and microgrids. Thank you so much, and I will pass it to Farhan to discuss clean cooking. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Lana, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you are. So yeah, I'll change topics a bit and talk about our report on clean cooking. David, if you could just confirm, or Olivia, if you can see my screen okay?
That's great, Farhan, yes, very clear.
Okay, perfect. So as we just learned from the first session, as well as the report on electricity access, there have been a lot of positive signs in electricity access, but the progress in the clean cooking sector has been relatively slow. The socioeconomic and health burden continues to fall on millions of people. And while some initiatives have been undertaken to address these issues, we wanted to evaluate how successful these have been and due to what elements these have been successful or not. So before I get into the study, I very briefly wanted to discuss the theory of change that forms the theoretical basis of our research. And essentially what this states is that at first there is a clean cooking policy or program, and assuming this leads to some initial level of adoption, this will result in the reduced use of clean fuels and technologies, as well as less time spent on fuel gathering and cooking, as well as reduced air pollution. Now, assuming this adoption is sustained over time, this can lead to long-term health benefits, especially for women and children. So while this theory of change may hold in a controlled setting, we wanted to see if it holds in the real world, where a number of cultural, social, economic, and environmental factors are at play. So guided by this theoretical framework, our main research question is, what is the impact of clean cooking programs and policies on adoption and health? We also explored some additional areas, such as how the impacts varied by fuel and technology, by geography, as well as I mentioned, we identified some common themes across effective programs. So we saw this earlier in the electricity access report. This is the PCOS framework, which guides our search and screening criteria. So geographically, we focused on low and middle income countries. Our interventions included any clean fuels and technologies ranging from improved biomass cook stoves to LPG to electric cooking, as well as any subsidies that focused on these fuels or technologies. In terms of outcome, we looked at three different categories. The first one is adoption, where we look at fuel consumption and the usage and maintenance of clean cooking technologies. For our intermediate outcomes, these include time allocation, so fuel collection time and cooking time, as well as exposure to carbon monoxide, which is a proxy for indoor air pollution. And for our third category, we looked at the long-term health impacts. So this includes pneumonia, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, acute respiratory infections, blood pressure, and hypertension. And for our study designs, again, we looked at similar studies in the sense we look at randomized control trials or quasi-experimental designs, which really allow us to isolate the impact of the intervention and ensure that the change in these outcomes was not due to some demographic or macroeconomic variable. So the methodology of the study is quite similar to the first. I won't go into too much detail for this study, but just to note that from an original 1,090 papers that we identified, we ended up with 86 studies, and 49 of these were included in the meta-analysis. So let's move on to our search results. So these show that we had overall 86 studies across 27 countries that covered more than 46,000 households globally. Now, if we do a quick comparison with the electricity access report, this number was more than 650,000 households. That is a big difference. It's almost 14x. And look, this is a back of the envelope calculation. It could mean a number of different things or nothing, but it's also plausible that this indicates how clean cooking initiatives have not been undertaken at the same scale as electricity. So moving on to some additional results, this shows our evaluations by region. So we see an near equal number in Africa and the Asia-Pacific region, as well as some studies in Latin America and the Caribbean region. If you look at Asia-Pacific, we saw a relatively unequal distribution of these studies. So we see some in South and Southwest Asia, East and Northeast Asia, about 10, and then 5 in Southeast Asia. So moving on, we see that the majority of our studies focused on improved cook stoves and biogas digesters. In fact, 75% of all the studies focused on these technologies. Studies on LPG, electric cooking, and solar cookers were not as abundant, so that makes it difficult to generalize our findings across these other technologies. So now that we've talked about the search results, I'll present a sample of one of the meta-analysis that we conducted. So this is on time spent cooking, and Lana already explained how to read this diagram, so I won't repeat some of those things, but just to note here that this particular diamond indicates that there was a negative impact on time spent cooking. So about 10 studies were included in this meta-analysis, and we recorded a effect size of minus 0.25, which is not that large, but it's also not negligible at the same time. So just to summarize here.
Sorry to interrupt, Farhan, you have 1 minute left. Sorry.
Thanks, Olivia. So just to summarize, these are the overall results of our clean cooking systematic review, and we see a reduction in fuel consumption. We also see an increase in time savings. We also see a reduction in carbon monoxide levels, but the impact on health was mostly inconclusive. We only saw a reduction for chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So just to put these findings into context, we found that even when households initially adopted clean fuels and technologies, they eventually reverted back to traditional biomass. Improved cook stoves, for example, were often prone to breaking down, and there were not any sufficient arrangements for their repair and maintenance. They did not always meet the various household cooking needs, which often result in stove stacking. And as a result, households discontinued their use in a number of the studies that we evaluated. So the lack of sustained adoption and the insufficient reduction in indoor air quality can also explain why we see a limited impact on health. So in conclusion, while many initiatives achieved positive results, they often struggled to achieve the level of impact that aligns with broader sustainable development objectives. So just to close here, given the mixed impact on adoption and health, we find that countries should prioritize the cleanest fuels and technologies in terms of lowering emissions. So these are namely LPG and electricity. But until these become widely available, affordable, and reliable, improved cook stoves can serve as a bridging technology. Next, we also identified some common characteristics among effective programs. And I won't go into too much detail now. Maybe we can touch upon these in the Q&A session, but these include inclusive planning and programming, increasing consumer choice to account for intra-community and household differences, small and flexible pilot programs with evaluations and feedback loops, as well as a framework for monitoring and evaluation to better inform programs and policies. In addition, we also saw a research gap on LPG and electric cooking, and there's also a need for more data to evaluate the impact by gender and age. So that is pretty much the end of my presentation. And just to add a final remark there that clean cooking is quite an underfinanced sector, and as we learned from the earlier sessions, there's little political momentum behind it. And until the broader landscape behind clean cooking changes drastically, it will be very difficult to achieve universal access to clean cooking, at least by 2030. So with that, thank you very much for joining, and I hope you found the presentation informative. Over to you, Olivia.
Thank you very much, Lana and Farhan. So this has certainly been very inspiring to hear about these two research, as they rigorously summarize large amount of available evidence and deliver a clear overview of the impact of energy access intervention. So with this, I already see some questions from our distinguished participant coming through the chat window. So let me start with the first question from Namiz Muzaffar from Sri Lanka, who makes the important point that more than affordability, there are many socio-economic factors that may influence outcomes. And her question is, does your research provide an insight about the relationship between continuation of solid biomass for cooking despite increased incomes? Then we have a second question from Namiz Muzaffar, who asks if there was any impact from electricity and clean cooking access on refugees and internally displaced persons. So Lana and Farhan, over to you.
Okay, I'll take the first question then on the relationship between income and whether that leads to a reduction in use of dirty fuels and technologies. So you can see my screen here. Maybe I'll just use the theory of change that I presented earlier. So it's definitely not a linear relationship between income and the reduction in the use of traditional biomass. There's a number of cultural, social, economic, and environmental factors. So affordability is perhaps just one element. So our research goes into a number of these factors and tries to go beyond just the economic aspect of it. So I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you, Farhan. And maybe I'll just add a bit to that and attempt the second question. So just to add to that, absolutely, fuel stacking is a huge factor, and that's, for many reasons, sometimes economic, sometimes cultural, but that's part of why this study was challenging and part of why we defined adoption very specifically as increased use of clean fuels and technologies and decreased use of dirty fuels and technologies, because it's not realistic to say, okay, did somebody adopt? It's very much not a binary. So to that end, I would just mention, a lot of the programs did find people going back to what they were using before. So I think the value of continuous monitoring and evaluation and contact is important to make sure people understand what their options are, understand what results can be from using dirtier fuels and technologies, but also to ensure that programs serve people's needs specifically to let people cook the way they want to cook, the things they want to cook, because that is something very inherently cultural, and it's very hard to have a behavior change. On the second question on whether there are studies in areas with refugees. So I really like this question because it is a challenge, and I think these are situations where it is very helpful to distribute improved cook stoves because they are just so easy to deploy. That said, I think this is a bit of a research gap for the type of research we were looking for, because we're looking at something very quantitative. So I think in these types of settings, there's a bit less research. But yes, from my perspective, I think that's a specific circumstance where improved cook stoves have the even more impact because they can move quickly. Thank you.
Thank you, Lana and Farhan, for this very insightful answer. Looking at the time, we have the time for just one more question from Dr. Abdul Malek Azad, and he asked to Farhan if LPG cook stove and solar e-cooking stove, which one is more clean and sustainable for off-grid area, and shouldn't we invest more in the solar e-cooking stove now for the near future as oil is running out? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Olivia, for that question. So absolutely, when you look at solar cooking, it's the most cleanest form of cooking fuel out there from the source to the end use, as opposed to LPG, which is quite clean when it comes to the end user, but may not be the case at the source itself. So we definitely should be looking into further developing solar cooking technology in the future. And we did have a couple of studies that looked at solar cookers, and what we see so far is that at this stage, the technology is quite, it's still in its initial phases. It's still dealing with a lot of issues with regards to cultural acceptability, as well as being able to meet the various cooking needs of households. And in addition, there's also the fact that it's weather dependent. So you do need to provide provisions for cooking when the sun isn't shining. So I'll close there, and maybe Lana, if you want to add to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a minor point that, yeah, I think absolutely, again, solar cooking would be an excellent sustainable solution. There is always the challenge of acceptability and desirability. So based on some of the more qualitative evidence, gas tends to be quite, like LPG tends to be quite popular as a cooking solution, which is not to say that solar couldn't work. I think this is where inclusive planning really helps, working closely between implementers and local communities to see how people want to cook and making sure that those solutions do allow them to cook what they want to. So I think that would be one pathway forward. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lana and Farhan. And so, distinguished participant, time is pressing us, so please excuse me, but we have to stop the Q&A here. I want to thank all our distinguished participants for the question, and continuing in our agenda, I will now hand back to David Ferrari to moderate the third session. David, over to you.
Thank you, Olivia. Yes, now coming to the third item on our agenda, we thought it pertinent to bring a group of highly experienced and knowledgeable practitioners to today's conversation, coming from areas of expertise not necessarily part of the energy sector, if you like. Our first speaker, Yongping Zhai, would be well known to many of today's participants. Mr. Zhai is Chief of the Energy Sector Group within the Sustainable Development and Climate Change Department at the Asian Development Bank. Mr. Zhai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, David. Let me share screen. I have a few slides. Let me try to find out this how this works. Energy ESCAP. Okay. Can you see it?
Yes, that's coming up clear.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank Hong Peng and your team and all the colleagues attending the meeting today. It's a great opportunity for me to learn what's happening in the energy access, and also taking this opportunity to share what ADB is doing broadly in energy access, and also in broadly in low carbon transition in Asia and the Pacific. First we I understand this session is talk about energy, but also beyond energy. For your information, ADB's Strategy 2030 has indicated 7 operational areas. I will not, read all of these. You have this on screen. You won't find the word energy in these priorities. Actually, energy is there to support each of these 7 priorities. Of course, tackling climate change would be mostly direct for energy to contribute, but also in addressing remaining poverty and reducing inequalities and gender equality. Because of this issue of clean cooking, I've been hearing all this morning. It's very, very important point, and we're not making enough progress. For ADB's operation, I won't repeat, a lot of messages have been already said, but I want to say that for Asia to move away from coal is very challenging, because we have 60+ dependence on fossil on coal for power generation. So what are the alternatives? Would be important technology issues should be discussed. I understand there will be a side event on phasing out coal. I will attend that session as well. But here I will just mention ADB's lending every year is last year is $4.2 billion, of which $2 billion in clean energy investment. That's renewable energy and energy efficiency. The remaining, the other 2.2 billion, mostly investment in transmission, and distribution systems. I believe these T&D networks are very important to take the renewable energy generation into the system. As we have seen lately in the US, that a stronger and smarter power grid is so important to ensure the supply security. These are the statistics more specific for year 2020, how much we have invested in, depending how you classify the investment, 84% of sovereign lending and about 10% of private sector lending. And we have mitigation, climate mitigation, 45%, adaptation, climate adaptation, only 2%, and 53% not classified as climate financing, as I said, mostly in transmission and distribution. This is the same picture, but in percentage terms. ADB's energy sector lending is 20% of overall lending for ADB in 2020. Actually, in 2020, ADB's lending, overall lending is $31 billion, of which $16 billion were dedicated for COVID response. So energy sector's lending, taking those COVID-19 response away, energy sector is actually very substantive investment last year, of which about 47% in clean energy, 53% in T&D and others. We try to measure our impact in clean energy investment. In these different indicators we use, additional renewable energy capacity in gigawatt, and also in watt hours. And also we measure CO2 reduction and electricity savings from our project. In terms of energy access, last year we invested $2 billion. This is another way to look at the same investment. Investment in energy access in 2020 was $2 billion, and last 8 years overall lending in energy access was $10 billion. So last year was a very important year for us in energy access. Over 10 million people, household, would benefit from ADB's lending in terms of electricity access, clean cooking access. As a development bank, we do also knowledge work. We want to actually share our understanding of the latest technologies with our borrowers and also for our own staff. We write and prepare handbooks in these different technologies, as you can see: microgrid, smart grid, waste to energy, energy storage. We are currently writing a handbook on hydrogen, and the note working paper on carbon capture, utilization, and storage will be published in the next few days. We are also just prepared energy sector perspective for the reopening of economy, the green recovery, energy sector's contribution to green recovery. That's a note we are preparing. We are also preparing different, for grant public information, we prepare different blogs. Myself, I write these blogs. And a major workshop forum of 16th Asia Clean Energy Forum this year. We'll cover 3 topics. One is the green recovery I've mentioned, and the second one is how to support the country's commitment on the Paris Agreement. The third one is a consultation on ADB's energy policy. I will touch upon this one later in the last slide. We want to support new technologies by launching these innovation challenges. Basically, we are inviting private sector innovators, startup companies, to come up with proposals in these technologies. For example, clean heating and efficient cooling, microgrid, artificial intelligence for demand-side management. And under this situation of a pandemic, we also launched innovation challenge in clean and efficient and disease resilient centralized air conditioning in public buildings. And these are the pilot project we are supporting. we also launched, I think among the development banks, we are the first to have established venture capital, ADB Ventures. We are supporting new technology under this ADB Ventures, including clean energy, but also in other areas that be considered, in health, in agriculture, fintech, and so on. We just made a first investment last week, an equity investment using this ADB venture money for investment in Indian Smart Joules Private Limited. This is an energy efficiency company. So this is our way of supporting private sector. I also want to share one example, ADB's public and private sector cooperation to support a solar project. In Cambodia, we are supporting a national solar park in Cambodia. In this project, ADB public sector lending window provide infrastructure investment for transmission and distribution and for the needed basic infrastructure for the solar park itself. Then once the solar park is built by the public sector, and the private sector will come in to install the solar PV installations, panels, so to generate power and being integrated to the power system by transmission lines. And this is the ADB's private sector can support these private investors. And also ADB also provided the advisory service to the government in preparing the whole project. So it is what we call one ADB approach, because different departments, different part of ADB has been mobilized to support this national solar park project in Cambodia. This is one example of how ADB promoting private sector development with public sector support.
Mr. Zhai, just noting our timing.
Okay, this is my last slide. ADB currently is preparing a new energy policy because of changes we have seen since last 10 years, since the last decade. We want to remain relevant to our strategy 2030, as shown in the first slide. And basically, we are undertaking consultations with stakeholders. I take this chance to show these questions in case that there are feedback on these questions. You may send to ADB. What are the alternative technologies to replace coal? What are the cross-sector issues energy sector should cover? And what are the priorities of developing countries? And lastly, how this impact of COVID-19 on energy sector and how should be our response? So these are the questions we asked the public for our consultation. And the new policy will be published, will be adopted hopefully by end of this year. Thank you very much. This is all from me. Back to Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Zhai. And now we turn to Inka Khadijanova from UN Women for Asia and the Pacific to provide her insights on the gender perspectives of energy access. Ms. Khadijanova, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you, David. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. David, could you please project my slides? I see that we have only about 9 minutes left until the end of our side event, and many of the points which I was going to mention have already been made by the previous speakers. So I also want to have some time left for the following speaker, for Paramita, who is working with me on renewable energy. So I will maybe skip a couple of slides, but for now, first I wanted to start by recalling that last year the global community has celebrated the 25th anniversary since the adoption of the Beijing Action Program, which is the global agreement on advancing women's rights. And while analyzing the progress that was reached by this important milestone, the governments have agreed that significant improvements and progress have been achieved in such areas of women's empowerment as the ending violence against women or the strengthening of gender equality in national governments and leadership. But the remaining areas of concern largely relate to limited access of women to energy and to natural resources. And this remains a significant area of concern according to so many assessments done by the governments at the national levels in our region and also at the regional level as well. So energy sector remains one of the least gender diverse sectors, and closing the gap in this sector becomes so important for addressing poverty and achieving sustainable development. And a few speakers have already mentioned this point. So yes, thank you for the next slide. Yes, thank you, please. Yeah, so I wanted to maybe explain a few points about the about the gender inequalities in Asia and the Pacific, which remains one of the least advanced regions in the world. And there are many studies that are done on the annual basis which assess the level of progress in terms of gender equality. And here I would like to refer to two such assessments. This one is done by UNDP on an annual basis and another one by the World Economic Forum, which update the indices that measure the level of progress according to different dimensions. And both of them agree that Asia and Pacific as a region lags behind compared to the other regions. The region is also diverse, and there are of course some regions that are moving ahead and some are lagging behind. And the ones where the access to energy and gap in access to clean cooking are also the ones where gender inequalities remain most severe. In general, the LDCs and the countries in South Asia are the ones where the gender inequality is still quite significant. Also, what's important to note is that also the advanced economies from our region that are included in the OECD still lag behind compared to similar economies in the other parts of the world. And here you see on the graph the lineup of countries according to gender gap, and the last two countries are South Korea and Japan. And also the same studies, they rank countries in terms of the progress in gender equality. And for example, according to the World Economic Forum, only two countries from our region are included in the top 10 countries according to the gender gap size, and this is New Zealand and the Philippines. And what's also remarkable is that one of these countries is the developing country. So it shows that not necessarily the gender advancement and women's rights correlate directly with the level of economic development and human rights. Human development. On the next slide, I wanted to mention a few reasons why the situation remains so severe in our region. And mostly the root causes for that lie in the persistent discriminatory gender social norms and values. Also, the region suffers from the lowest rate of political representation. There's significant bias in the legal policies and structures. There's also a bias in the informal legal arrangements, and the region suffers from the significant rates of gender-based violence. So if we move on the next slide, I wanted to give you a few of pieces of statistics, but this already has been mentioned, that the region indeed has advanced significantly in terms of electrification rate, but those people who remain without access to the electricity are usually populations in the rural areas, predominantly women who are in the older age groups and in the low income groups. And when it comes to the access to clean cooking, the situation is more dire. And again, this is the women who dominate those who remain without access. And these are also the women who suffer the most from the negative impact of limited access to clean cooking. And it was mentioned that there is a direct correlation between the number of indices of premature deaths attributable to household air pollution. And according to our information, around 60% of those deaths happen among women and children. And of course, this is to the fact that women are primarily responsible in the household for cooking, for collecting the clean fuels. Last year, due to the COVID, women also were the ones who were disproportionately affected by the impact, and UN Women has made an assessment that around 47 million women in our region are expected to fall behind the poverty line, so they will be the so-called new poor. And of course, there is a risk that due to the affordability issues, they will resort to the use of unsustainable fuels, because of the potential loss of income, jobs, and livelihoods. So on the next slide, I wanted to share with you the findings of the global study that was done by the IUCN a few years ago, where the comparison was done at the global level between 192 national energy documents, and these documents were analyzed on the reference to women or gender in the text of the documents. And here you see the regional split. So the blue top are the number of documents where women was mentioned. And as you can see, in sub-Saharan Africa and in Asia and the Pacific, the shares are significantly higher than in the other regions. And usually that's the reason that because the importance of recognizing and integrating gender in the energy policies is usually perceived as a development issue. So the advanced economy, only 4 advanced economies have included reference to gender or women's rights or the gendered analysis. And despite the fact that the issues are different in the developed and developing countries, still even in the developed countries there are issues in terms of women's access to science and technology, also opportunities of women to advance and take the leadership positions in the employment sector, in the government and in the private sector as well. So then on the next slide,
Inka, I will have to ask you to start concluding as soon as you can.
Yes, that's my last slide. So then the first analysis was made on those policies where gender was mentioned, and only in 2 countries women were presented as agents of change. So women continue to be perceived as victims, as vulnerable, as those whose capacity needs to be built, and rarely they are recognized as holders of unique knowledge and opportunity holders. So I will stop here. Thank you, David, for the reminder, and I will pass the floor to Paramita, with whom we are working on the joint UN Women, UN Environment Regional Program, Empower, which is about gender mainstreaming and climate change and disaster risk reduction policies. Thank you.
Thank you, Inka. Without further ado, please go ahead, Ms. Paramita Mohanty.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Inka, for setting the context, which would be easier for me for the intervention. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. I don't have any specific PPT or slides, but I would try to bring few of the key messages specifically from our own experience on implementing project on the ground through our Empower project, which is jointly implemented by UN Women and UNEP, as mentioned by Inka. So I will start the notion by saying that in order to design a very inclusive and relevant policies, we need to include and we need to reflect on the ground practical experience and learnings and best practices. So with that, in that context, I would try to bring 3 important aspects which we believe that is important for the policy formulations. So the first point is on the policy and planning formulation at the provincial or the state governments. So whenever we do that, it's important to involve the local stakeholders, and it's also important to link and converge the existing institutional and budget structure in order to avoid parallel operating structure. For example, in Cambodia and in Vietnam, we are working with in few provinces and developing provincial action plans specifically for sustainable women entrepreneurship through renewable energy. And what we are trying to do is include those sections in the provincial investment plan and the rolling investment plan of the countries, so that whenever the budget allocation happens, automatically budget would be allocated for this kind of specific sections. So in that case, even if Empower project would not be there, or even if any dedicated project would not be there, even after the exit of this kind of projects, there is every possibility that this kind of finance or budgeting will continue, and similar kind of entrepreneurship project can also be implemented on the ground. The second point is, whenever we do the women entrepreneurship projects through renewables, we can try to include or integrate that with the NDCs and SDGs target. For example, we are doing this in Vietnam and trying to see how can we integrate those action plans with green growth strategies and action plan of Vietnam. The third point, which is much more important, is access to finance, and specifically if the access to finance is for small scale renewable energy systems, and that too for women groups. So what we try to do in few of the Southeast Asian countries is try to see how our funds or the development funds can be used more as a funds for catalytic improvement and as revolving, so that more number of similar projects can be implemented. And when I said catalytic, means if we can bring more alternative finance or private sector investment into that. So we are working with the countries and with various local banks in few countries to see if we can come out with some credit lines, and our funds will be used as a de-risking instruments to facilitate dedicated credit line for women's entrepreneurship. And the fourth point, which is also important, is on skill sets developments. And with this digital transformations and digital technologies, and after post-COVID, what we found that it's also important for women to be capacitated on digital technologies, on online sales and marketings, and on ICTs, and how to improve their skill sets. So we are going to come out with more digital and online platforms and training and e-learning modules specifically for women entrepreneurs to see how they can improve their skill sets and access the digital markets and the business network and do their business in a better and sustainable way. So we will have more e-learning modules and courses under Empower, and we will get back to most of you to see how can we define and outline those course modules. So those are few of the important and critical aspects what we believe is important for the national policy formulations and sustain this kind of women entrepreneurship program. So with this, I will stop here, and we can take off if there is any further questions or interactions. Thank you so very much to all of you, and over to you, David.
Thank you so much, Parimita, and to all of our speakers. I think we have gone over time, so please allow me to take a moment to thank all of our speakers. My apologies to the questions we were unable to address and for rushing you at the end there, particular Parimita, but we really appreciate you wrapping up so quickly. We have taken note of the outstanding questions, and of course we intend to continue this discussion in future. Very briefly, I'd like to provide some concluding remarks reflecting on today's discussion. Firstly, on the status of energy access, it's clear that we have made great strides in the last 2 decades, but there's a very long way to go this decade if we're to deliver the 2030 targets. It's apparent that finance isn't always going as needed, and more data is needed to understand the impacts, especially in understanding the vulnerabilities of women and girls, and especially for clean cooking, which we heard, there is a factor of 14 times less data available in evaluation studies. Secondly, on the key outcomes arising from ESCAP's analyses, I won't reiterate the detailed results, but I'll remind participants that both of our reports, along with 2 associated policy briefs summarising the key recommendations from policymakers, are now available on the ESCAP website. And if we could put those QR codes on the screen. Thank you, Kunmei. So just following these QR codes will take you to our publications. And finally, I think it's clear from the conversation that we have a long way to go, with gender inequality in our region lagging well behind much of the rest of the world, and that the energy sector remains with some of the least representation by women. We have remaining biases in legal frameworks, social norms, and others that are the root causes of these issues. And there's much that we can do as policymakers and as the energy sector to better address these issues. Once again, thank you all for your active participation in today's event. I'll now hand the microphone back to our Master of Ceremonies, Olivia Baldi, for some final housekeeping notes. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, David. And again, I apologize for the slight overrun of time. But before we close this event, I would like to share some final notes with all of our participants. So first, I encourage all of our distinguished participants to provide their feedback about the side event via the link that will be shown on the screen or that will be shared through the chat box. And then I would like to remind all of our distinguished participants that the second side event on the phase out of coal in the Asia-Pacific region will begin in 30 minutes. If you are not registered but would like to attend, please contact us via the chat box. So here is the evaluation feedback link that you can download, and please provide your feedback at this link. And then the final session of the third committee on energy will start at 2 p.m. followed by the closing remark at 5 p.m. So on behalf of ESCAP, it's my great pleasure to thank all of the distinguished panelists. And ladies and gentlemen, I wish you all a great day. Thank you very much.
Thank you.